Well, this is the podcast from Multifaith Matters, and I am the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today for the first episode. We start our second season with this episode to have as my guest, Mark Townsend. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Lovely to be able to meet you and to be able to be here.
Yeah, it's great. We've, I don't know how we got connected. Was it through Phil Wyman, perhaps? We've been connected via Facebook and had some exchanges and comments there. Do you recall?
Yeah, I don't know how it all began. I think it might have been just after I brought out the book Jesus Through Pagan Eyes.
Okay.
I think that somebody suggested that we have a bit of a discussion then, and I don't know whatever reason it didn't happen, but we've been sort of posting things ever since, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into that. Jesus Through Pagan Eyes and the volume that I edited, Beyond the Burning Times, it brought a pagan and Australian Christian together for conversation. Let me read your bio so folks know about you. And if you want, feel free to supplement afterwards or correct anything. I think I've got a current bio for you. Mark Townsend, a former clergyman in the Church of England, now leads his own inclusive and ecumenical ministry that nourishes a strong appreciation for the diversity of faith beyond Christianity, which strives to honor the divine in all people, regardless of their faith, culture, sexuality, or background. A priest of the Open Episcopal Church, almost said Episcopalian, and member of the Progressive Christian Alliance, in addition to being a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. The author has been featured on the BBC and several other news programs throughout Britain. He's the author of Gospel of Falling Down and Jesus Outside the Box, amongst other volumes. And he lives in, I hope I pronounce this correctly, he lives in Hereford, Hereford, England. You know what? I'm just going to have to take a trip to the UK to get corrected on how to pronounce things. So that would be awesome. So that's Mark. Anything you want to add, or
the only one thing you mentioned, the Open Episcopal Church. I'm not a member anymore. I've got great friends with them, but I'm not a member of that particular church anymore. But I am still a member of the Progressive Christian Alliance.
Okay.
So,
I don't know.
That's great.
Yeah, I might have grabbed this off Amazon, or I don't know if it was your website or what have you, but in the program notes for folks, I will include the bio and a link to your website and all of that. I was especially struck when I looked at your website by you're providing a ministry, a service to people who may not have connections, with the church. I know I don't know how much you know about the United States, but I'm in Utah. And it's predominantly Mormon Latter-day Saint population, but you've got an increasing number of non-Latter-day Saint and people who aren't affiliated with church. And I discovered when I moved out here, as in California where I was previously, there are people who don't go to church and yet still need, they want at certain times in their life, weddings, funerals, that kind of thing. They need people to get involved. And if they don't have formal church connections, it's hard to find that. So I appreciate you doing that. How did you, was it just you felt a need?
Do you know it? Because I was as you read out, I was a priest in the Church of England for a while. When I eventually left, what happened was people just started coming to me to ask me to do things for them, primarily funerals. People who who saw themselves somewhere at the edge. They didn't really want to go down the path of religion, but they didn't want to go humanist or atheist. They just felt somewhere in between. And ever since then, I've sort of sat in that place. So I kind of one of the terms that some of my other friends call me is a hedge priest, because a hedge is between two fields, or between two gardens. And so but I always kind of had that approach, even when I was a Church of England vicar. Or the vicar is a priest,
Right.
I always took that kind of approach. I wanted to meet people where they were at, rather than try to force them into a box, or any particular religiosity.
I know that can be a challenge. I have my own religious convictions as you do yours. And I've met with people who don't share those, and yet trying to modify, how you would do a ceremony so that it's still something you resonate with, and it also meets their needs, can be kind of a challenge to navigate that. So I appreciate what you're doing. I wish I could do more of it here. It's just so hard to get word out. If people aren't connected to certain religious networks, it's hard to let people know. But I'm glad to see what you're doing in the UK. I thought it would be interesting for us to have a conversation. We've mentioned that we've been connected on Facebook for a while now. And I don't know why we haven't had a conversation before, but we haven't. So here we are. And I thought, rather than just exchanging comments on Facebook, I don't know about you, but I don't think Facebook lends itself very well to any kind of productive conversation on, on deep kinds of subjects. So I thought we would do it here. But before we get into some questions and contrasting, these kinds of things, can you share a little bit about your story? Because, people aren't just about what they believe. They aren't about ideas. It's a part of a journey. What's your journey?
Yeah. Okay. So I was a pretty mixed up young lad who was into all sorts of things when I was growing up. I didn't particularly feel very kind of happy with myself. For some reason, I grew up with a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I'm not sure why. I was bullied a bit at school. I was quite frightened of authority, and never really felt particularly, I suppose, it's not a sob story, but particularly loved. I was, and it's nothing to do with my family. I just grew up that way, so from a kind of young age, I saw myself as sort of searching for something beyond, and I very quickly got into all sorts of paranormal stuff, not practicing it, but sort of searching for UFOs, men in black, spiritualism, all those kind of things, Uri Geller. And alongside that, I also got into performance magic, as in illusions like David Blaine, stuff like that, because I kind of see it this way, that one was kind of trying to tap into those kind of experiences, and the other was trying to sort of mimic them. But alongside that was this kind of feeling of not really being worth a lot. And so when I got into my teens, it didn't happen automatically, but I just started feeling sort of religious thoughts, and I hadn't had a particularly religious background, but I started to explore things. First thing I did was phoned up the local vicar, which is the local Church of England chap. I didn't get a very satisfactory response from that particular person, but in the end, I found my stepbrother was going along to a Pentecostal church, and he took me along. This was, I guess, I was about 15 years of age, and of course, the Pentecostal church, it is both a sort of supernatural experience of God, but also it's something that, so it kind of caught me that way, but it's also something that for a young guy who didn't think a lot of himself, to hear about this God who loved you and who died for you was very powerful. And so I was hooked. So that was my first kind of taste of religion, really, of a faith, a spiritual faith. Now I'm a natural questioner, and I didn't, after a couple of years, I mean, it was a very powerful few years being with that particular church, but I started asking questions, and the questions I was asking were not being answered satisfactorily. So I sort of got myself squeezed out of that church, in terms of just being someone who I suppose was just a natural questioner. And one thing led to another. I spent some time in Israel. This is probably about 19 years of age. I went over to Israel for 4 months just to try to kind of clear my head, do something completely different. And I came back a completely different person, because I'd experienced some of the more traditional holy places and the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions in and around Jerusalem. By the time I got back home, I just couldn't fit back into that sort of Pentecostal tradition, and so I ended up in the C of E after all. And I had along those years, or during that time, I had something of a sort of religious calling, and that kind of came with me. So that's how I ended up a C of E vicar. That's a pretty long answer to your question, but
No.
that's my kind of background. Yeah, and all the time I am I find myself, and I'm doing this right now, I sort of get settled and then I feel unsettled again. And it's a sort of process of I suppose, finding something and then seeing the cracks and then moving on and finding something else. And so even being ordained in the Church of England, which was for me a very beautiful and powerful experience, and ending up with my own church, even that didn't sort of satisfy in the end, and various things led to the end of that story.
Okay, I think that's a very important, because again, it's not just about ideas. It's also these we adopt ideas and practices based upon our life journey, and that can change. And so that's important as people listen to our conversation. They know what kind of context in your life journey. Just really quickly, for folks who follow this podcast regularly may know, but in case they don't, my own journey is different here in the American context. I was involved in a Mormon offshoot in my teens, and then got involved after becoming an evangelical in a very, very conservative form of it, and was involved in what's called countercult apologetics. Right. And I thought the way to warm people's hearts to the gospel message was to tell them they were unbiblical and going to hell and this kind of thing. Thankfully, I've always tried to be open-minded as much as I can and try and be well-read. And I was reading in missiology and the history of Christian mission and sociology of religion, and I discovered different perspectives. And that eventually led me toward a seminary education with a major in intercultural studies. Right. And I've always been interested in the dialogical approach, that one can still disagree, but do so respectfully and as a part of a journey that one takes with others. So folks who may hear me disagree with you as the conversation progresses, it's not rooted in any kind of American fundamentalism. I'm very self-critical about my faith, perhaps to a fault. I know kind of the popular term these days is deconstruction, and I try and frame it a little more positively. Evangelicalism reimagined. What would it look like doing things, differently? And so I have rethought a lot of the aspects of my faith, as well as a part of my life journey that has been different than yours. So just a little context for folks as we go along. So I appreciate that. Having heard that long story, if you were to come up with a few labels that would describe you and your spiritual journey, what would those be?
Progressive, certainly. Nature-based. I'm happy to use the term Christian. There was a period where I wasn't, and maybe some of that was to do with sort of pain, personal pain. Maybe some of it was to do with perceptions that other people have of that word. But I'm happier now, Christian. I am still member of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. So I'm kind of druidic in terms of how I approach things as well, which we can get on to. Magical. I don't mean me, but I believe Earth is magical, life is magical. So those are the sort of terms I'd use.
Okay, I think that's helpful to allow you to have your own labels rather than folks try and label you accordingly. I think if I were to come up with some for my own, I'm more comfortable, even though I still somewhat reluctantly consider myself an evangelical. I don't really identify much with American evangelicalism. I do British evangelicalism. Right. I'm not just interested in the culture wars over creation, evolution, and these kinds of things. I've moved on. I try to bring my faith into conversation with other religious traditions, with science. So I think dialogue, neighborliness, hospitality, all those things. And I think I am more comfortable with a Jesus follower or a disciple of Jesus than I am with, evangelical and those kinds of things. So anyway, that's a little foundation for you and I in the rest of our conversation as we proceed here. Can you connect some of those labels that you provided with me with your book, Diary of a Heretic? What were you trying to do? Is it just telling your story in that context, or what are you trying to accomplish there?
So this goes back to the original story, and I think I feel like I made a mess of that story, to be honest, because it's something that still kind of hurts me, I suppose, and I still feel a certain amount of shame over. But yeah, that was a book. I write books for myself. Now that sounds quite pretentious, really, but I write books because I find that it's the way that I learn. You know, I ask myself a question, and then I do some research, and then actually, even more importantly than the research, I just listen to myself talking it through. And I believe that my books, anyway, are kind of dialogues with myself. My first book was all about the dialogue that we have in our heads all the time, the Gospel of Falling Down, and the different voices that we hear. But Diary of a Heretic was, it was me trying to work out where I was as someone who'd left mainstream Christianity, had found another path, which was Druidry, you know, the ancient nature-based tradition of Britain, and trying to follow myself through a year. So I wrote a kind of diary almost every day, diary entries, just following what was happening. Because another thing that I do feel, and this maybe sounds a bit silly maybe, but I do feel that when we go through changes, and when we grow, and when we expand, and especially when it seems we're on a path that we need to go on, I feel that we spot things that are kind of synchronistic more out there and in the world and in our life, and almost magical things. And so that book, reading through it now, and I've done that a bit just because I know that you'd read it, or had a look at it recently. It's filled with these little sort of almost embarrassing synchronicities that I take note of, not because it's God showing us anything, but I think it's just life maybe patting us on the back and saying, you know, there's something here, there's something more, and you know, these meaningful coincidences. So that was a book, which it was in many ways a lazy book, because I just wrote it every morning, or whenever I felt like it, and I followed the sort of things, the movements, the things that were happening in my life. So I followed myself to different experiences that I'd never had before, like going to a witch's coven or something, and exploring. You know, I mean, I've had so many adventures these last decade or so that I never would have dreamed of before. Some were, you know, quite unnerving and almost frightening. And I'd been on, you know, vision quests, and you know, gone on druid camps and all sorts of things. So I wanted to follow my own life as a ex-Christian priest in a pagan world, and just see what was going on. And I see all of these as you know, they're not about the answer, they're about the journey. And you know, at the end of all of my books, I'm kind of almost thinking, you know, or I'm asking the question, what's next? You know, where else am I going to be led? Because I find it's so thrilling, really. And again, that's why that story that I told about my exit from the Church of England was something I had to do, because it was like a gift. It was releasing me into this place where I am now, which I'm still at. And even the last few months, you know, I'm going in a different direction. You know, so that was that book. Does that answer that?
Yeah. And I appreciate the continuing journey and asking questions and all that. I mean, I think, you know, I thought, well, I'll go to seminary years ago, and then after I go to seminary, I got to figure it out, right? And I actually think I've learned more. Nothing wrong with my seminary, but I think I've learned more post-seminary than I ever did when I was going. And I don't know if that makes me a really poor Christian or a really good one, because I continually, you know, probe and ask questions and rethink things. So I think we have that in common.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you've talked about Druidry, and you've got a book, Jesus Through Pagan Eyes, Bridging Neo-Pagan Perspectives with a Progressive Vision of Christ.
Yeah.
How do those things come together? What were you trying to accomplish with that book, and how did you connect with Druidry?
Yeah. So again, it's something I needed to do. It's actually an American publisher that they offered me the opportunity to write a book and to come up with a subject. So I thought this is a real gift. And to me, the big thing that I discovered after leaving mainstream Christianity and getting involved in pagan groups, and most of these pagans still knowing that or still thinking of me as a priest, even though I was moving away from that myself. Conversations that I had about Christianity, which I started to call churchianity, maybe cruelly, I discovered that many of these pagans actually loved Jesus or had a huge respect for him, and yet couldn't stand the church, had real issues. A lot of them had come from church backgrounds. I went to a very big gathering of Druids in Glastonbury, and I did a presentation on the stage, and I asked them at one point how many, just hands up, have come from a Christian background. It was well over I would say about 3/4 of them. It was a huge amount, and a lot of those Roman Catholics, and so they had this kind of church background that they'd rejected, but talking to them, Jesus was still someone that they had a great affection for. And then other pagans who were not from Christian backgrounds also seemed to have this fascination with Jesus as a person. Now, so I decided I want to write a book about Jesus, but not for Christians and not for Christo-pagans, the ones who kind of, hybrids, but for pagans who are fully who see themselves as fully pagan, and who have lots of gods and value from the gods of India to the gods of Norway to the gods of Great Britain, but seem to, in many ways, there seems to be a gap when it comes to the God of Christianity. So I wanted to try and find out, is there some way, not that I could bring Jesus to them at all, because it's not an evangelistic book, but to kind of give them this, or to give me, because I was at that stage feeling that I was going full blown into paganism, but could I still hold on to Jesus as a friend and be a pagan? That was really the premise of the book. Again, as I said earlier on, the journey is still continuing, and I'm changing in my sort of view of this. But reading through, because it's about 10 years ago that this book came out, and the other thing about it, of course, was that I was able to interview maybe 20 of the leading figures in world paganism on Jesus, and some of them wrote me wonderful essays, some of them answered questions, and all of them blew my mind with the sort of things they were saying about this person that is at the heart of Christianity. So so the book really begins with, it's in 3 sections, but the first section is trying to peel away, first of all, if you can do this, the Christian layers from Jesus the man. So I got into historical Jesus stuff, and I soon came across this notion. We're all aware of the idea of the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. I think there are actually 3. There's the Jesus of history, the Christ of faith, the Orthodox Christ, and the cosmic Christ, or the universal Christ. And we see all of those in the Bible. And I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, so I'm using other people's works. But I kind of came up with this tripart Christ, this idea of 3 Jesuses. And I was interested that when I shared that with my pagan friends, Jesus' history, absolutely, they have no issues at all. They'd think of him as one of their own, in a sense. And the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ, the spark of deity in all things, that's very much a pagan concept anyway, so no problem. Where they have the issue is with the Jesus Christ of the church, or as Marcus Borg will call the post-Easter Christmas Jesus. And this is something now that I'm going through myself. So if you ask me questions about this, I'm not going to be at all clear, because I'm still, but I kind of, it just made sense to me. And in a sense, it gave me a little bit back, because I didn't want to chuck the baby out with the bathwater, and I couldn't anyway. I mean, I've worn a cross all the way through this, because I still love the person of Jesus, and I still feel the presence of Christ. But I also have issues with what the church has done to that person of Jesus, making him feel exclusive, and I don't know, it's sometimes even unforgiving, so that's what this book was about. It was trying to give a picture of Jesus, or to present a picture of Jesus that would be exciting and quite challenging, but liberating to pagan people.
That's a helpful backstory. And as I think we mentioned at the beginning when we started this conversation, I think it was your efforts in regards to that book. And I think maybe around the same time, I was working on the book that came out, Beyond the Burning Times, as editor. Mm-hmm. And if folks want to, pick up either of our books, they're different perspectives with similar goals in bringing Christians and pagans together for conversation. My own story in regards to the book was I had been looking at paganism and studying it, having dialogues with pagans, because some Australian Christian colleagues of mine had been doing this for a while. And they said, if you're looking for another religious tradition that you might want to get to know, this would be a good one. And I dove in, and then I came across American pagan writer Gus, and I hope I'm pronouncing Gus's last, Gus de Zariga, I think is how he pronounces it. And he wrote a book, and I think it was called Pagans and Christians. And he wrote it in such a way as if a pagan and Christian were having a dialogue. And I thought, well, I appreciate the effort, but wouldn't it be great if a pagan and Christian really had a dialogue?
Yeah.
And so I reached out to Gus and I said, if I can find a respectful, knowledgeable Christian to have a conversation, would you be willing to do it in print? And he said, yeah. So I connected Philip Johnson in Australia with Gus, and they had a conversation. And like your book, it's not evangelistic. It's trying to look at, key concepts of divinity and creation or nature and all kinds of things to find out commonalities and differences. And I remember a few years ago when our books came out, there is an American pagan website, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was listing Christian efforts at addressing paganism. And I think both of our books are mentioned in the same piece. Right. Yeah. Do you remember the name of that?
I can't. No,
I can't remember. Anyway, whenever I would pop in on that pagan website, it was kind of like a love-hate thing. They would appreciate what I was trying to do, but Moorhead's still a Christian, still trying to evangelize, this kind of thing. But so we do have that commonality as well there.
Yeah. I had that as well. I had quite a lot of criticism from various pagan voices. Some quite I don't know. There was even on Amazon, the reviews. Some were quite damning, and clearly hadn't read the book, because they were assuming that my whole purpose was to evangelize pagans, and it's nothing like that.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, as many pagans have had a bad relationship with Christianity and Christians in the past, and there's that historical concern and clash. So these kinds of reactions are certainly understandable. Continuing on, you mentioned Marcus Borg, and I think that's helpful. Before, I want to have a conversation about that question of the cosmic Christ, because that's one area where we would disagree. You mentioned Marcus Borg, and you and I mentioned this when we had an exchange. I think it was through Facebook prior. In the book, In the Meaning of Jesus, Marcus Borg at N.T. writes a fascinating conversation where these two scholars talked about what does Jesus mean, and they come away with there's some areas of overlap, but there are also some areas of difference. And what I think is helpful at the beginning of that book is they each talk about their perspectives they bring to unpacking answers to that question. They talk about worldview, literary sources, history, and that kind of a thing. And because they're coming from different vantage points, they come away with different interpretations. And I think the same thing is going to be true of you and I in looking at that question of cosmic Christ. So what kinds of frames do you bring to try and understand Jesus the way in which you do now that help provide answers to that question?
The big thing for me is experience, and also I suppose the biggest voice who has kind of helped me in holding on to some sense of Christianity has been Father Richard Raw, the Franciscan priest based in Albuquerque. I met him about 22 years ago, and for a different reason, because he was wonderful on the idea of brokenness being something that is valuable, and that's perfect for me. So I went on a vision quest retreat with him, but he seems to me to be able to articulate a wonderful vision of Christianity that remains kind of orthodox in a way, because he's never been silenced by Rome, and that's something, you know. And he's I would say that he is far more orthodox than someone like Matthew Fox with his approach. But what he says about cosmic Christ and the way that he explains it, the way that he sees it as an ancient belief, and that he follows it through certain saints, particularly the Celtic tradition, the Franciscan tradition. So it's very much part of ancient and medieval Christianity. And it simply refers to the divine aspect of matter. You know, he would say when deity and matter come together, you get incarnation. And so he would say that I think he would say that the incarnation of Christ is true, and is also true for all of us, and is true for all things, that there is this divine spark, you know, within all things, within all matter. And I know that you can find phrases and scriptural phrases that might disagree with that, but you can also find others that kind of affirm it, you know, even in Paul. And that's what works for me. You know, I just feel, I think sometimes it's a matter of where your heart feels comfortable. And that might sound, again, sort of egocentric. You know, who are we to decide what truth is? But it just works for me. You know, I see God as a loving creator. Through his will we are created, everything is. So it makes sense that his image would be within his creation. I was thinking the other day that if you look at an artist that you're familiar with, like Rembrandt or Monet or whatever, you kind of know who it is before you see it, because you know their style. And, you know, I think of us as almost like that, you know, we have the mark of the creator in us. And I would say that that's what cosmic Christ is. It's, you know, it's the divine within all things. And to me, the beauty of Christianity, and I know Christianity means so many different things to different people, but to me, it is about sort of awakening people or helping people to remember what we already are. I see sacraments like that. I see marriage is like that. I see marriage, the sacrament of marriage, to me is not the minister or the priest marrying two people. It's those two people recognizing what they already are, which is married, and then asking God's blessing. I see the Eucharist in the same way. I see baptism in the same way. You know, plunging. In our tradition, we baptize babies, plunging that baby into the love of God and saying you are already a child of God. You know, I know that does sound woolly and liberal, but that's kind of that's where I am in it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I too appreciate the experiential. I think also the reason why I would come on with a different understanding than you do is I also want to be a good student of worldview, of the context of Second Temple Judaism and what was going on in Jewish thought, messianic expectations, these kinds of things. So we disagree. It's not that I'm trying to force creeds upon the text. I do think creeds are important. I think the church spent a lot of time trying to think in their own cultural context what that Jesus experience meant. I'm not saying discard creeds, but I think even the creeds need to be carefully assessed. I think our church traditions and beliefs, just because a given denomination says this is it, doesn't mean that's necessarily so. So we just need to rethink these things. And so I appreciate the frameworks that you and I are bringing to the very different conclusions that I think we come to on the cosmic Christ. Now, you said a little bit about it in your book, Diary of a Heretic. You say Jesus is, you posted this recently. I found it interesting, again, on Facebook recently. Jesus is the man whom the Christ was somehow strangely embodied. Others have also embodied this Christ-ness, not least the Buddha. Christ is a concept / reality of an incarnating spark of God in all things. This is a panentheistic approach to the divine. Would you add anything to that to help folks understand what you're trying to communicate there?
There's quite a lot in that, and I'm kind of, in a way, I'm kind of crossing over. It begins with the idea of Jesus, Jesus himself being the human incarnation of this cosmic Christ, and then sort of recognizing, or me recognizing that, or like I said before, that I do believe that Jesus comes to show us what all of us are, at least potentially, like a mirror. And I know that's probably more sort of Gospel of Thomas than the Gospel of John, but but it's sort of it just makes sense to me to see Jesus in this way. It's the only way really that I can hold on to him. I can't really cope with the sort of literalized "I am the way" of John. I have to make the metaphors, because to me that it's too harsh. It's too in the club or outside the club. And when I talk about the Buddha, a lot of people have said that the Buddha nature is a very similar concept, even though Buddhism is completely different to Christianity, and in a sense comes from a totally different metaphysics and everything. It's there are similarities in the fact that the Buddha was an actual historical person, and Jesus was, and yet they both represent more than that. They represent what is the sacredness in us. That's how I see it. What else? Because it was a pretty dense thing that you just read out.
You mentioned, let's see, the Christ is the concept / reality of an incarnating spark of God in all things, and then a panentheistic approach to the divine.
Yeah. Again, I've had this struggle. I ask myself every so often, what is God? And I mean, who on earth can begin to answer that? But I've kind of come round to thinking about this. God is, of course, transcendent. God is everywhere. God is beyond. God is, in that sense, unknowable. And yet, surely, the Christ part of God is that God is knowable. That God does come close to us. That God is someone that we can have a relationship with, or at least he symbolizes that. And so, to me, panentheism is a great term, even though it's quite a modern term, but a great term for sort of talking about the immanence as well as the transcendence, and that God is right here, right now, with you, with me, inside this microphone, inside that candle. God is everywhere. And I don't think that's particularly radical. I mean, we talk about the omnipresence of God. Surely that means God is everywhere and in all things. Maybe not, but that's the way that's the way I understand that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that perspective. I think by way of response, again, because I want to understand the New Testament text within their context of Second Temple Judaism, I don't know that panentheism fits. Judaism has been classically understood as embracing
Monotheistic.
monotheism, right?
Yeah.
And holding in tension both transcendence and immanence, but not in the sense that the divine nature of being is infused within everything. So having said all that, I think N.T. Wright I'd like you to respond to one thing he says in his conversation with Marcus Borg. He says, as I follow this path, the one he's already laid out as to how he disagrees with Marcus Borg, I discovered Jesus who was not simply an example, even the supreme example, of a mystic or spirit person, such as one might meet in principle in other cultures. I find rather the Jesus I have just been describing, Jesus is a first century Jewish prophet announcing and inaugurating the kingdom of God, summoning others to join him, warning of the consequences if they do not, doing all this in symbolic actions and indicating in symbolic actions and in cryptic and coded sayings that he believed he was Israel's Messiah, the one through whom the true God would accomplish his decisive purpose. Is there any of that you identify with? Do you go beyond it, or what would the distinction be for you?
That's moving to a different question now. And some of that, yeah, of course, I identify with this historical man who leads a movement and who's expecting something. I don't myself, at the moment, feel that Jesus would have applied messianic language to himself. I just because I kind of trust. I trust the scholars that are telling me that there is a big distinction between the pre and post Easter Jesuses, and it helps me again to make sense of the Bible, to see part of it as interpretation looking back and part of it as history remembered. And there are certain parts of the Jesus story that I find easier to understand in terms of the church's reflection, and therefore not coming from the man himself. And that's probably one of them. I certainly place John's "I am" statements in that category as metaphorical statements that were put into Jesus's mouth rather than remembered. I can't harmonize Mark's Jesus, who says only God is good, with John's Jesus, who almost says I am God. I can't harmonize that. The only way I can do that is to understand and to take on board the historical Jesus scholarship. But on the other hand, so that's one part of what N.T. Wright was saying. But on the other hand, as a metaphor, then yeah, I mean, I have no problem at all. And this is where again we're getting back to cosmic Christ. I've even been rethinking or re-exploring, partly in preparation for talking to you, the resurrection and what that means to me. I'm not someone who has to have a bodily resurrection. I'm not someone who has to have an empty tomb. I have been to both of the places where they say Jesus rose from the dead in Jerusalem, and one of them was incredibly impressive and brought tears to my eyes. I don't need the empty tomb to be a follower of Jesus myself, but I am coming around to believing that there was a surge of power that was a resurrection of some description that affected those disciples and turned them from people who would run away to people who were prepared to die for the faith. So even now, I'm still modifying and exploring and moving on and coming back and quizzing myself and testing myself. And that resurrection of Christ is cosmic. That's what I think Paul met on the road to Damascus. I don't think he bumped into a physical Jesus. I think he was thrown off his horse by a blinding light, which was some sort of cosmic experience of a cosmic Christ. And of course he wouldn't have used that language, but yeah, does that, I feel like I'm waffling.
No. I just wondered what your response would be to that. I just, by way of response to what you said, even though I take a different view, not because I'm making a dichotomy between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. I think the Jesus of faith must, of necessity, be intimately connected with the Jesus of history.
Mm.
And as you know, there are scholars who would take a different view on how to understand and the relationship between the two. So I would take issue even within my own tribe with those who would understand a Jesus of faith that is divorced, that isn't properly rooted within the Judaism of Second Temple Judaism and so on. So I think we need to do our careful homework and make sure that whatever we come away with by way of faith commitments, that it is properly grounded accordingly. So that would just be kind of my response to it. One last thing in the few minutes that we have remaining in our conversation here, what kind of approach do you take in interfaith kinds of conversation as it relates to what seem to be irreconcilable differences between traditions? You did a post not too long ago in Facebook where you talked about love, and that was kind of the common element between all religious traditions. And I appreciate the sentiment, and it's certainly there, but even in something as foundational to human experience as love, it plays a different role and is understood differently in the religious tradition. So what's the relationship between commonality and difference for you in interfaith relationships?
First of all, the romantic in me gets a little carried away at times. So I know, of course, there, and I mean, even that word love, one of the things that I struggled with within paganism was the notion of divine love, because a lot of pagans simply don't believe in it. I mean, some gods will love you and hate you the next minute. I mean, it's a difficult tradition in that sense. In fact, you mentioned Gus's book. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his second name, but he gave a beautiful description of the unconditional love of the goddess. And that to me was, I had it on my wall for a while, because it was, while I was going through those sort of pagan years, that was something I really wanted to cling on to, because I couldn't find much of it within that tradition, even though they were the most loving people. My Druid friends, and I love them to bits, and they really walk the talk. They do ooze with unconditional love, even though strangely they don't require it from the gods. It's a strange one, but yeah, I mean, I think we have to be realistic and honest. We have to realize, first of all, that Eastern traditions and religions are completely different from Western, even in where they begin, in terms of what this stuff is. It's not to me, it's not an illusion. To me, matter is real. And of course, when we start to say things like all roads lead to God, or everything's the same underneath, I think that's possibly quite offensive to people from other religions. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I forget now who it was, but he said one of the things that he loves in his interfaith dialogue when he speaks to imams and rabbis is when they say to him, as a Christian, you obviously believe in Jesus who said turn the other cheek. Well, why don't you? Because it was a real, like, he was being convicted by non-Christians who knew Jesus, and who knew what Jesus stands for, and who was saying, why don't Christians realize that? Why don't they follow that Jesus, or the Jesus who says go another mile, or the Jesus who says blessed are the peacemakers, or love your enemy? So that kind of interfaith dialogue, when it's very honest and recognizing the differences, we can all learn from each other. I think it's similar in a way to even interdenominational dialogue. I was at a theological college in Oxford, where we had 3 colleges, all representing the 3 different traditions, high, low, and broad, in the Anglican Church. And when we got together to put on some sort of worship, it was so watered down and grey that it didn't really suit anybody. And I think what we should have done is invite people to the different colleges and have a full-blown Catholic mass in one, and then have a charismatic worship in another, and let people see the differences and celebrate the diversity, rather than try to have some uniform nothingness. And I'm sure the same is true with religions. The Druids that I mingle with at the moment, they often have gatherings with a local Hindu community, and now in a sense they're strangely quite similar in their approach, but they will go to a Hindu celebration of Aarti with the lights, and they will plug in and they'll be part of it, and they wouldn't, for the life of them, they wouldn't want the Hindu people to try to make it acceptable or water it down in any way. So yeah, I mean, my approach to interfaith dialogue has always been unity in diversity rather than uniformity.
Well, we are certainly agreed there.
That's good.
And, you know, I kind of inhabit this strange space in interfaith, or I prefer the term multifaith, because, you know, interfaith tends to so focus on commonality that it either minimizes or even sometimes ignores they're just perceived differences. And I think they're very real. And I think they're real and important to people. And that's why they gravitate to one tradition versus another. And I prefer to acknowledge and work through and hold that in a peaceful tension. We're going to work together for the common good in spite of our differences in this area. So I think we have more common ground there.
Good.
Yeah. Well, Mark, we've been at this for an hour, and I appreciate you coming all the way from, is it correct to say across the pond? Is that what we're supposed to say?
Yeah.
From across the pond, and having this conversation. And one of the things we try to do here at Multi-Faith Matters is model respectful conversations through differences. And I think we've done it. And it's